His Majesty's Prison at Pentonville on Caledonian Road in the Islington district of North London is one of the most famous prisons in the country. Over the years, it has housed a host of famous prisoners, including Oscar Wilde, who was held here in 1895 before being transferred to Reading Gaol, and Cold War spy Dr. Klaus Fuchs, who was sentenced to 14 years in 1950. Footballers Robin Friday and George Best both served time in Pentonville, as did actors Keith Allen and John Alford. DJ Simon D was an inmate in 1974 for a non-payment of a fine, and musicians Hugh Cornwell from the Stranglers, George Michael, Boy George and Pete Doherty have all been imprisoned here in more recent times. Pentonville opened in 1842 to replace the Millbank Penitentiary that stood on the banks of the Thames near Pimlico. It was the first modern prison, and although only 25 years old, became quickly outdated. Designed by Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Jebb, R.E., it took over 2 years to build the new Pentonville Prison at a cost of £84,000, the equivalent to around $11 million in 2025. Standing in 8 acres and surrounded by an 18-foot high perimeter wall, its radial wing design was influenced by the separate system developed at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, USA. This meant that a single prison officer standing in the centre would, turning his head, view all 4 wings in turn. The new prison had separate cells for 520 prisoners, each measuring 13 feet long, 7 foot wide and 10 foot high, and with a small window high on the wall which could be opened for ventilation. This design proved so satisfactory to the government that a new programme of prison building across the country began. The need for the new prison was threefold. The increase in the country's population brought with it an increase in the crime rate, and, with transportation to the colonies for convicted criminals coming to the end, new jails were now needed. Also, more space for inmates was needed during this era, as the number of offences that would send someone to the gallows was greatly reduced from several hundred to a mere handful. Conditions in the new Pentonville Prison were a vast improvement on the archaic Newgate Gaol and other older establishments, and prisoners were encouraged to undertake work such as oakum and coir picking, unthreading old tarred rope, and basket weaving. In the 20th century, the cells were updated and modernised. During the last night of the Blitz, on Saturday the 10th of May 1941, there was one last concerted attack on the capital. In what was later known as the Hardest Night, over 1,400 people were killed in London and 1,800 seriously injured. Pentonville suffered a direct hit from a string of high-explosive bombs, destroying part of the 4-storey sea wing and killing 13 people. The wing was closed after the bombing and the ends walled up, and the isolated stump, renamed H Hall, reopened in 1946. Rebuilt to 3 storeys, it was linked to the main building by a corridor, and in 1958 became the prison's education block. In 1902, the execution chamber was situated in the prison grounds, at the end of B Hall, which also housed the original condemned cells. This necessitated condemned men having to walk from the cell to the gallows, which often proved to be an ordeal for a terrified prisoner. In 1928, in line with modernisation at many other prisons, a new execution suite was built at Pentonville. It was now located in A Hall, close to the prison entrance, and consisted of a gallows room built into the prison wing. The execution suite was constructed over 3 floors. The ground floor cell ceiling housed the trapdoors through which the prisoner dropped. The middle floor was the gallows room, into which the condemned man would walk directly from the cell, a distance of just a few feet. Painted pale green, it contained the lever, the trapdoors of 2 heavy oak leaves, each measuring 8 foot 6 inches long and 2 foot 6 inches wide. The cell above housed the beams and chain mechanisms to which the noose was attached. It wasn't until the closure of Newgate in 1902 that prisoners under sentence to death were housed at Pentonville, and following the closure of the former, the gallows beam and mechanisms were transported across the city and installed. Following an upheaval in the whole procedure of recruiting and training executioners in the late 1890s, anyone wishing to become a hangman would have to attend a course of instruction before being placed on the official list. The first courses took place at Newgate in 1900, but following its closure, the executioner's training school was transferred to Pentonville. Amongst the first men to graduate were Tom Pierpont and William Willis, who both went on to have long careers on the gallows. All would-be hangmen passed out of Pentonville until 1960, when training was transferred to Wandsworth in South London. People who applied to be added to the Home Office list of executioners had to first face an interview at a prison close to the applicant's home. This was designed to weed out those unsuitable, whose motives to apply may have been fueled by a gruesome or perverted interest. Successful applicants were invited to attend one-week course at Pentonville, with expenses and travel paid for by the Home Office, where they were taught how to pinion the prisoner, calculate and rig the drop, and carry out a mock execution using a dummy. Applicants were constantly monitored. Nerve and discretion were all requisites of a hangman. Equipment needed to prepare the scaffold for execution included the ropes and straps, along with the block and chain used for removing the prisoner from the gallows, were housed in special execution boxes and stored at Pentonville. These execution boxes would then be dispatched by rail to prisons around the country when needed. Apart from its fellow London jail at Wandsworth, Pentonville was the busiest prison in the country for executions, with 120 people ending their life on the gallows here. There are a number of reasons for the higher than normal count. Several spies and German prisoners of war convicted by court-martial were hanged at Pentonville, and the jail also received prisoners sentenced to death from further afield than North London, where many provincial prisons were downgraded or acquired by the military around the time of the First World War. Therefore, prisoners who may once have been hanged at places such as Chelmsford, St Albans or Hertford were now transferred to Pentonville for execution. The first hangmen to officiate at Pentonville were William and John Billington, the last members of that family whose dynasty stretched back to the 1880s. Both Billingtons were assisted by Henry Pierpont, the first of a new family of executioners, and a name that stayed at the head of the short official list of hangmen until the late 1950s. Rochdale barber John Ellis's first engagement as an executioner at Pentonville was to hang Dr. Crippen, and in the next 13 years he made over 20 visits to the prison in the capacity of executioner. In 1925, Hertford hangman Robert Orridge Baxter took over the mantle of chief executioner at the jail, and for the next decade carried out every execution until his failing eyesight meant he was no longer fit for duty. Tom Pierpont, William Willis and Alfred Allen also pulled the lever at executions here, and it was at a Pentonville execution that Willis's conduct was brought into question and was to lead to his dismissal. Likewise, Alfred Allen was also dismissed following an execution at Pentonville when he refused to follow instructions on the correct placing of the noose. Another hangman whose career also ended at Pentonville was Stanley Cross of Fulham. Cross had graduated from Pentonville in the autumn of 1932 alongside Albert Pierpont and promoted to a chief executioner at the start of the Second World War. He executed Udham Singh in July 1940 and 3 spies that December, and on each occasion the medical officer at the jail noted that he didn't think Cross was competent in calculating the correct drop needed to dispense instant death. Albert Pierpont made his debut as a chief executioner at Pentonville on the 31st of October 1941 and vied with his Uncle Tom for work at the prison during the war. From 1946, with his uncle now pensioned off, Albert Pierpont carried out every execution until the temporary suspension of hanging in 1956, when the death penalty was being debated in Parliament and which led to the passing of the Homicide Act in 1957. By the time hangings were reintroduced, Pierpont had tendered his resignation, and the chief executioner was now Harry Allen, a publican living in the Manchester area. Allen officiated at 3 of the 4 post-homicide act executions at Pentonville, with Robert Leslie, Jock Stewart carrying out the other, that of Norman Harris. Both Stewart and Allen had assisted Albert Pierpont at the jail on many occasions. Like many Victorian prisons, Pentonville is said to be haunted. One of the ghostly apparitions said to walk the grounds is that of Dr. Crippen. The piece of grass adjacent to the original execution shed is known to this day as Crippen's grass, and it is here, it is said, that his ghost, complete with a crooked neck, has been seen to wander. HMP Pentonville remains in use as a major Category B prison to this day, holding around 1,100 prisoners, remanded by both magistrate and Crown Court, along with those serving short sentences or beginning longer ones. This Tales from the Hangman's Record YouTube special looks in detail at the stories behind the 120 murderers, spies and traitors who were all hanged at Pentonville. On a hot July evening in 1902, a small sum of money was stolen from John MacDonald, a 24-year-old costermonger, as he slept in a run-down Salvation Army shelter on Middlesex Street in London's Aldgate district. Discovering the theft, he looked at the other lodgers and instantly suspected 30-year-old Irish ex-soldier Henry Groves. Confronted with the accusation, Groves, known as Mickey the Irishman, denied the theft, but MacDonald was not satisfied, and Groves' disappearance from the lodging house on the following day seemed to confirm his suspicions. Scotsman MacDonald was not going to let the matter drop, and a few days later he was seen at the shelter sharpening his knife, muttering that he was going to kill Groves over that $1 I lost. On Thursday the 28th of August, seeing Groves enter a shop in Oldcastle Street, MacDonald followed him inside, and when a row broke out between the two, they were asked to leave. Groves left first and began walking towards Wentworth Street. MacDonald followed a few moments behind, and as he approached the school at the top of the street, where Groves worked as a caretaker, MacDonald approached, grabbed him by the shoulder and began to punch him. Groves hit back, knocking MacDonald to the ground. As the fight escalated, Sam Dodds, a friend of Groves, tried several times to pull them apart, as another man ran to find a policeman. Groves gave as good as he got, but as his strength began to sap, he attempted to make his escape. As he turned on his heels, Dodds saw MacDonald draw a knife from his pocket and watched helplessly as he caught Groves by the arm, twisted him round and plunged the knife into his neck, severing an artery and cutting his windpipe. Groves staggered along the street with blood oozing from the terrible wound, as Dodds managed to wrestle MacDonald to the ground and detain him until the police arrived. Henry Groves collapsed and died from his injuries before medical assistance could be given. At the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Walton on Thursday 11th of September, MacDonald's defence was that he was so drunk when the murder took place he had no recollection of committing the crime. Evidence of his threats to kill Groves over the money he had stolen was given in court, as was the evidence of a friend of MacDonald's who testified that less than an hour before the murder he had made a similar threat. Evidence was also heard of a statement MacDonald made at Spitalfields police station when, pointing to the knife, he claimed, "That's the knife I did it with, I did it intentionally." He was hanged just 33 days after committing the brutal murder. John MacDonald holds the dubious honour of being the first man to be executed at Pentonville, the gallows beam and post having been recently installed following the removal of the now closed and soon to be demolished Newgate Gaol. Having fought bravely on the front line of the Boer War, 31-year-old Henry Williams left the 4th East Surrey Militia and returned to his lodgings in Fulham in July 1902, expecting to resume his relationship with widow Ellen Andrews, the mother of his beloved 5-year-old daughter, Margaret Annie Maggie Andrews. Although they were not married, Williams and Ellen had been together for almost a decade, and they kept in regular contact by letter while he was serving in South Africa. Returning home that summer, Williams began to suspect that Helen had been unfaithful to him and had been carrying on an affair with a sailor while he was away fighting for his country. Although she admitted knowing the sailor, Helen denied that anything untoward had taken place, but Williams was not convinced. In early September, Helen took Maggie to stay in Worthing, Sussex, and on the 10th of September, Williams travelled down to see them in order to collect Maggie and take her back to London with him. Still convinced Helen had been unfaithful, the visit ended in a fierce quarrel, and as he was leaving to return to London, he made a chilling parting statement. "I will not hurt you, Helen," he said coldly, "but I will do something which will break your heart and brand you so you will never hold your head up in this world again." Quite what she imagined he would do is not known, but it probably never crossed her mind the lengths to which her suspected infidelity had driven him. Later that evening, and back in London, Williams was having a drink in the Lord Palmerston public house on the King's Road in Fulham. He was sitting with friends when he began to talk about his feelings for his daughter. He pulled out a photograph and tears welled up in his eyes as he spoke. "Do you think I can let my little Maggie call another man daddy? It would drive me stark raving mad." He then began to ramble, but the gist of it seemed to suggest that he had killed his daughter. One of his friends became so concerned at what he was hearing that he went in search of a policeman. When he returned in the company of Detective Inspector Walter Dew, later to find fame as the man who caught Dr. Crippen, Williams finished his drink and climbed to his feet. "I know what you have come for killing my little girl. God bless her, I will swing for it like a man." With Williams held in the local police station, officers went to his lodgings and discovered the body of his beloved daughter lying on the bed, covered with the Union Jack flag. Beside the body was a note: "May God bless her dear little heart, and may her good soul go to heaven, and may I, her heartbroken father, be forgiven." Tried at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Jelf on the 23rd of October, Henry Williams's defence was based on insanity through jealousy at the time of the murder. Ellen Andrews, whose infidelity Williams strongly suspected but had never been confirmed, was the subject of abuse from a large section of the crowd when she made her way into court. She sat in tears in the dock as the court heard Williams say he had killed Maggie so that she wouldn't grow up to be like her mother. He said that after putting his daughter to bed, he told her they were going to play a game. He covered her eyes with an handkerchief and then cut her throat, placing a doll beside her body. The jury returned a guilty verdict, but added a recommendation for mercy, and when asked if he had anything to say before sentence was passed, Williams stood erect and in a firm voice said, "Nothing whatsoever. I am only too pleased to receive it and get out." Williams kept up his brave demeanour throughout his time in the condemned cell, chatting and playing cards with the warders. On the night before his execution, he said he had killed his daughter because he feared that if she was brought up by her mother, she would grow up to be unfaithful and would break men's hearts. Henry Pierpoint, who assisted William Billington, later recorded in his memoirs that Henry Williams was the gamest and bravest man he had ever executed, and that he had shown no fear as he was led to the gallows. It was a most unusual relationship. 32-year-old Emily Coates was the illegitimate stepdaughter of Thomas Fairclough Barrow, a 49-year-old dock labourer. When Barrow was widowed 15 years before, Emily stayed with her stepfather, and the relationship soon developed into a semi-incestuous one, and during that time she bore him several children, although only one survived. By the autumn of 1902, they were living together, to all intents and purposes as man and wife, in a two-room apartment on Red Lion Street in a run-down part of Wapping. Strange as the relationship was, it was also an unhappy one. Emily frequently complained to friends that Tommy beat her, and following one particularly fierce assault, she fled and took refuge in a friend's house in nearby Shadwell. On Friday night, the 10th of October, Emily turned up in tears on the doorstep of her friend and neighbour, Jane Corker, complaining of being beaten and kicked by Barrow, and asked if she could stay the night. Her neighbour agreed. 6 days later, Emily served Burrow with a writ for assault, which needed to be responded to within 48 hours. On the following night, warrant in hand, Burrow went to see where Emily was staying and demanded to see her. Told she was out, he began issuing a number of threats that he'd resolve his grievance with her imminently. Shouting through the letterbox, Burrow proclaimed coldly that they weren't idle threats, as "you shall know before 12 o'clock tomorrow." On the following morning, as Emily walked to work down Glamis Road, Burrow ran up behind her and stabbed her 5 times, once in the heart, killing her instantly. Burrow was arrested within minutes and seen resigned to his fate. "This will end it all. Now all I want is a rope around my neck." During his trial at the Old Bailey on the 19th of November, Dr. James Scott, the medical officer at Brixton Prison, who had examined Burrow while on remand, told the court that the prisoner had complained of headaches and claimed to have suffered from sunstroke while serving in the Navy. His counsel pleaded vainly that when Burrow had killed Emily, he was temporarily irresponsible for his actions and therefore not guilty of wilful murder. The jury rejected these claims, not even leaving the dock, before indicating to Mr. Justice Bingham they believed Burrow was indeed guilty as charged. To 20-year-old barmaid Martha Jane Harwick, he was becoming a pest. She was used to the flirting and suggestive chat from the regulars at the Lord Nelson public house at Whitechapel, but whereas most customers knew where to draw the line, 28-year-old Charles Slow was beginning to make her feel uncomfortable. Martha lived at the pub which was owned and run by her sister, Jane Starkey, and throughout the summer of 1903, she had grown to dread finding the pint-sized, stockily built dock labourer entering the bar. Without fail, Slow would make a point of asking Martha to go out with him, usually when he was drunk. When it became clear he was taking no heed of her refusals, she took to avoiding him when he came to the pub, and would busy herself with other customers or find some other chore to take her away from the bar if business was quiet. Slow gradually began to feel she was making a fool of him by discussing his failed advances with the other barmaids, and early in September, a lodger at the Lord Nelson heard Slow threaten to stab Martha if she continued to shun him. In the early evening of Wednesday the 23rd of September 1903, Slow visited the pub and seeing him enter the bar, Martha immediately went to serve in another room. When she went back in the main bar a short time later, she saw he had gone and breathed a sigh of relief as she carried on serving. There were no licensing laws of note in the early part of the last century, and unfortunately for Martha, Slow returned to the Lord Nelson again shortly after midnight. Seeing her standing close to the bar, Slow approached and struck out, hitting her on both shoulders. Although witnesses thought he had used his fists, he had in fact been holding a sharp knife. "I've got you now," he shouted, as Martha slumped to the floor, fatally wounded. Slow fled from the bar, with landlady Jane Starkey in pursuit, shouting for help and asking people to stop him. A burly docker detained Slow, who was brought back to the public house. In his pocket was a blood-stained knife. Tried before Mr. Justice Bingham at the Old Bailey on the 21st of October, Slow's defence stated that a mixture of provocation and drink had led him to commit the brutal murder. The prosecution refuted this by saying the police surgeon who had examined him shortly after arrest confirmed that he was only mildly drunk and certainly not enough to be unaware of his actions. He also dismissed the issue of provocation, saying that rather than being provoked, he had simply killed her because she had rejected his unwanted advances. After 2 months on the high seas, the relationship between 40-year-old seaman John Sullivan and 17-year-old cabin boy Derek Lothian had started to turn sour. Both had joined the SS Waiwera at London prior to it departing on the 6th of January 1904, bound for New Zealand via South Africa and Uruguay. Sullivan, a native of County Durham, soon formed an attachment to the young boy, which quickly developed into an intimate relationship. The older man had a very jealous nature and would often berate Lothian if he saw him chatting to other deckhands, and by the time the ship reached the Cape of Good Hope, Lothian had made it clear to Sullivan that he did not want the relationship to continue. Sullivan, however, was smitten and had no intention of letting things go. They had a fierce quarrel that resulted in coming to blows and only ended when Sullivan pulled out a knife and threatened to cut his head off. He was put in irons, brought before the captain, fined and imprisoned for 7 days. When Sullivan had served his sentence and was free to resume his duties, the two men would quarrel whenever they saw each other. On one occasion, Sullivan was seen by one of the shipmates holding an axe, claiming this would be a good thing to do away with someone. On the evening of the 18th of May, as the ship steamed towards Tenerife, Sullivan warned Lothian to beware, and asked what he meant by that. He replied, "Wait and see." He added, "I will break your neck. I can't stand this much longer, and there will be a murder done before morning." Later that night, as Lothian was talking to a quartermaster on deck, Sullivan appeared carrying an axe. Before Lothian could speak, Sullivan rained down blows on his head. The quartermaster hurried to fetch a doctor, but as medical assistance was vainly given to the stricken boy, Sullivan stood by and shouted, "You don't need no doctor, he's dead enough, I've knocked his brains out." Lothian died within minutes, and Sullivan was again put in irons. He asked to see the captain and said there was a letter in his pocket which would explain everything. The letter ended with the sentence, "I shall cut his head off and take it overboard with me." On Tuesday the 2nd of June, as the boat docked in the Thames, detectives boarded the vessel and arrested Sullivan. "I am sorry I did it. I am sorry for my appearance," he said as he was led away. Sullivan stood trial at the Old Bailey before Mr Justice Grantham on Thursday the 23rd of June. His defence claimed insanity, stating that since he had joined the Navy, Sullivan had suffered from heart disease, melancholia and bad teeth. Although the jury debated whether there was grounds for reducing the charge to manslaughter through provocation, they quickly returned a verdict of guilty as charged, but requested mercy on the grounds of provocation. Following the passing of sentence of death, Sullivan addressed the court complaining, "I consider that the judge summed up in this case as if he had a personal spite against me, and he also went to sleep while my lawyer was pleading for my life." The hangmen were asleep in their quarters, and in the gallows chamber, 2 ropes hung taut, stretched with sandbags that would allow the executioners on the morrow to fix a drop accurate to the half-inch. Inside 2 condemned cells at Pentonville, prisoners 12298 and 12299 were spending their last nights on earth, oblivious to an extraordinary turn of events that was taking place outside. At a few minutes of midnight on the 12th of December 1904, a man had walked into Whitechapel Police Station and asked to speak to a detective. He then made a full confession to a murder that had Assistant Commissioner Sir Melvin McNaughton rose from his bed and hurried to the station to deal with the situation. Detectives who had been investigating the brutal murder were all present as discussions took place whether to advise the Home Secretary to cancel the executions pending further inquiries. The confessor was grilled on several points, and after extensive interrogation, the officers came to the conclusion his story was false. Gradually, his confession was unravelled as a pack of lies, and as he was removed down to the cells, he was asked why he had volunteered a false confession. "I just wanted to do them a good turn," he said, admitting that he knew neither of the 2 condemned men, whose last hours were quickly ticking by. It was early in the morning of Wednesday, the 12th of October 1904, when a paper boy, arriving for work at a newsagent and tobacconist shop at 478 Commercial Road, Stepney, started a major murder inquiry. Surprised to find the shop unlocked and with no sign of the proprietress, the fearsome Miss Matilda Farmer, he waited around, unsure what to do. A short time later, another boy turned up at the shop, and when told of Miss Farmer's absence, he reported this to his employer. The police were called, and when an officer entered the shop, he found a set of false teeth and a boot lying near to the counter and a pair of glasses on the stairs. Miss Fermor was discovered lying face down on the bed, hands tied behind her back and a towel forced in her mouth. Although there was a faint pulse where the detectives checked, by the time the police surgeon arrived, she was dead, and there was no sign of any money or jewellery. Evidently, the killer or killers had found what they had come for, and with the back door locked and the windows barred, had presumably left via the front door. A witness told detectives he had seen two men, one of whom he recognised as Charles Wade, loitering by the newsagents the night before and then again early in the morning of the murder, shortly before Miss Fermor had opened the shop where the newspapers had been delivered. Kept under surveillance for several days as the police followed up different lines of inquiry, 22-year-old Charles Wade and his 35-year-old half-brother, Joseph Potter, also known as Conrad Donovan, were eventually arrested and, when picked out of an identity parade at Brixton Prison, were charged with willful murder. Both had long criminal records for robbery and violence. Before Mr. Justice Grantham at the Old Bailey in November, both vociferously proclaimed their innocence. None of the stolen jewellery was found in either man's house, and one of the police witnesses admitted that he had seen pictures of Wade and Potter prior to the identity parade, and at which two other witnesses had failed to recognise them. Despite this, the jury took less than 10 minutes to find both guilty of willful murder. 8 days before the men were to hang, workmen at the shop lifted a floorboard and discovered the hoard of cash and missing jewellery. The killer's haul had been nothing like the police had surmised. Although there was some public disquiet regarding the outcome of the trial, moments before Potter was led to the gallows, he turned to the prison chaplain and made a brief statement to show that the verdict was indeed the correct one. No murder was intended. It wasn't Matilda Fermor's first brush with crime. On Tuesday night, the 20th of November 1888, as a young lady in East London, Matilda Annie Fermor was attacked by Jack the Ripper. With the attacker being disturbed, he fled, leaving her with only minor injuries, becoming one of the few to survive the Notorious killer's murderous rampage.